The solution that people seemed to think was the best one here at the time was, let's try to get a government of national unity in charge. And so in August, in fact, of this year, various other people were brought in to an enlarged government. The idea is, let's all get together as Malians to see if we can think of a way of a solution to this crisis. That, I think, for lots of reasons, I'll explain in just a second, has very little chance of success. A government of national unity of this sort is unlikely to have the authority to actually reestablish order there. And so this, we are basically living an extension of this at the moment, representing, as I said at the beginning, a worst case scenario, much worse than we had thought imaginable. There's trying to sort of a sense of what happened here. How did this happen? Mali was a darling of most of the world. It was the model of democracy in West Africa for 20 years, etc. It's interesting now to read how much one reads the sort of pundits and reports, etc., talking about the corruption of the Atete regime, the implication in drug trading, etc. One heard an awful lot less about that while we were supporting Mali and while we were involved. Mali was a key partner in the Trans-Saharan counterterrorism project, etc. And so I think it's partly that we didn't see it coming and there's sort of a retroactive thinking. But what did happen? Clearly, Qaddafi's fall is not enough, right? That was the clearly Qaddafi's fall was what precipitated, the consequences of Qaddafi's fall was what precipitated, right? It was the spark that lit the powder keg, but it wasn't the underlying cause. And clearly, it's true that as we look back on it, that the government of Atete, that in many ways Mali's democracy, it was a very hollow one, it was a very weak one, and particularly the Malian state was particularly weak. In fact, we could talk about that because I happen to be interested in internal Malian politics, but if we look back, for years, it had been very clear, Atete, the president who was ousted, had been ruling for 10 years in what he called a consensus government, right, with no political parties. And basically, he was the hero of the overthrow 20 years ago who had come back and been allowed to basically run the show because no one could challenge him. It was as if we had suspended politics for 10 years, waiting for Atete to finish his mandate so that then we could restart it again, hence the concern about what's the system here? Does it work? We didn't really know if the system worked. So there are a lot of reasons to now, with retrospect, and even at the time, people pointed to these weaknesses of the Malian system. But the fact that it would collapse this quickly seemed almost unthinkable. So, having laid all that out, and now I have lost sense of time. I'm okay? Okay. You guys tell me if I'm going too long. I still have a few things to say. Having laid all that out where we are, can we fix this, right? I mean, from the beginning, the idea was, wait, we need intervention, we need to get things back. The original assumption was we have to go back to the status quo ante. We have to restore Mali as it was, etc. I think, at the moment, it is virtually impossible to imagine the sequence of events necessary to restore normality, if by that we mean what Mali was in early March of 2012, right, or March 21st of 2012. To do that, it would require, first of all, a government in Bamako with actual authority, right, to reestablish some sort of authority in Bamako. A government strong enough to then rebuild an army that is deeply divided, very weak, and not clearly in control of anyone as far as I can tell, or I think other people can tell. That army would then have to reconquer the north in extraordinarily hostile circumstances, extremely difficult geographic and ecological kind of zones, and presumably do it in opposition to these Islamist groups. Maybe they would flee into the desert, right, as the army approached Gao and Timbuktu. But to actually occupy and establish order over the entire north is extraordinarily challenging at the best of times. And then we would have to, even if they were able to do that, then what? You have to somehow have a government capable of renegotiating some kind of a social and a political contract with the populations of the north to say, let's go back to what we had, let's go back to Mali, right? Something which at the moment does not look particularly attractive to people in the north, right, who blame a lot of that. Each of these things seemed extraordinarily difficult from the very beginning, and I would posit that at each step of the way since March, it seems to get only more difficult for various reasons. As I mentioned, Sanogo and the junta still apparently have the power to checkmate. The having found no other solution to this, the idea of the government of national unity was in fact the one adopted. That government is, which came into place in August, maintains the same president, the interim president, whose mandate has now been accepted for 1 year, and the prime minister, who's got his own history of this, very interesting, but I won't go into it. But that government's been handicapped from the beginning, right? You bring an interim government of national unity means, first of all, when you bring in a lot of people, significant logic of it is sharing the pie. Everybody wants a share of something, right? When governments of national unity's logic almost inevitably is, what do I get out of it, right? Yes, I want to be. And everyone's positioning themselves to say, you can't be a government of national unity without me. I'm very important. And because I'm very important, I want X ministry or X resources or whatever. In addition, it's very clear that some key people have an actual incentive not to solve the problem. As the longer a situation of this sort persists, people have a vested interest in maintaining that status quo and see that, in fact, they're not likely to maintain power, not likely to maintain ministerial posts or such perks after some sort of transition, and so they have an interest in sort of maintaining it at the moment. And in addition, the previous regime's image is highly tarnished. The president and the prime minister have very little authority. It's not very popular. It was seen as the problem, not the solution, and so going back to that is not very a popular kind of thing. Now, in addition, as I alluded to, I think even if all of those steps were to happen and we could pull it back together, the challenges would be extraordinary for attempting to govern. The Tuareg, large numbers of the Tuareg, and I should point out that the populations of Timbuktu and Gao are not only Tuareg. In fact, the Songhai and many other populations with varying relations with Tuaregs and others are in this region. But to point, the Tuareg are usually the ones we talk about as the people directly affected, and the MNLA was a Tuareg movement. The Tuareg of this area are extraordinarily disenfranchised. Some, of course, joined these liberation movements. Many did not. Most of them have found themselves, many of them have found themselves in refugee camps in Niger, in Burkina Faso, and in Mauritania, right in this area. There are large refugee camps. I was across the region again this summer in July of this year, and in each of those three countries, I was in Niger and Burkina and Mauritania, among others, I heard reports, and there were reports in the press of the refugee camps saying that the Tuareg in those camps, that the tone, the sort of message that was coming out was, we were the ones who didn't support the MNLA. We were the ones who stayed with the Malian government. We believed in Mali. We were not separatists. And now we don't believe in it anymore. Mali betrayed us. The promise of a unitary Mali was betrayed. We're suffering the consequences of it. There's no going back. And that apparently, it's hard, of course, to tell exactly how many people share that, but it seems to be a very dominant sentiment among many of the Tuaregs who have had to flee those areas. This is providing, actually, interestingly, another opening from the MNLA, who is insisting now, who has stayed on the margins, but who still exists as an organization, who's saying now, we are the only solution. You see, the only solution is back to the Azawad. It is an independent Tuareg homeland in Mali, and we are the only thing, the only plausible, credible partner, and the only plausible one that could replace Islamist groups running the north of the country and have some legitimacy in the north of the country. And so the MNLA is using it. They're fairly effectively, from what I can tell, spreading this message. By yesterday, the day before, I watched a YouTube video that shows, apparently, and looks fairly credible, Malian military, remnants of the Malian military, massacring Tuareg civilians, right? They had them tied, they were talking, they're speaking in Bambara, and it's translated, and the MNLA's got quite sophisticated background somewhere. They have it in subtitles in both English and French, and it's up there saying, shoot them, kill them. They tied people up, and they were massacring Tuareg civilians. The MNLA, the veracity of this, of course, is hard to tell, but it's perfectly plausible that that's happening in some parts. But certainly, it's a huge propaganda tool for the MNLA, positioning itself now as saying, there's no going back to Mali, right? If we can, and trying to line up the rest of the world saying, help us oust the Islamists, but there's no going back to Mali. Azawad is what we should think about. Even if we could, in this, I'm sorry, unfortunately, pessimistic litany. Even if we could go further, I think other reasons why we can't go back to the old Mali. The religious landscape has clearly changed significantly and dramatically. The old regime is really discredited. In Mali, before the coup, the Islamic organizations, not necessarily Islamists, were very powerful and very vocal, but they were playing the democratic game. They protested very vociferously against the adoption of a family law in Mali a couple of years ago, and were in fact able to stop it. But they stopped it because most Malians weren't in favor of it, right? Or they were at least able to tap a very important part of popular sentiment. And so they were playing the democratic game, but they were very critical of Mali and of Malian government, and they were critical of this sort of this secular Western model, etc. Those people, and especially in the person of Mahmoud Dicko, who is now president of the High Islamic Council of Mali, have attempted to present themselves as possible intermediaries between the Islamist groups in the north and the South, right, in any kind of political compromise. It is almost inevitable that should even Mali be reunited in some kind of a way, a very important part of the discourse would be that what we cannot do is go back to that model. Look where it got us. The secular Western democratic model is not the one. And I think it's very likely that some significant portion of the population in a place where this was not the story before would subscribe to an argument that said, yes, we don't want this Taliban style, if you want, Sharia of Al-Qaeda, etc. But we need a true Islamic state. Maybe we should think about a state that does incorporate religion, and maybe that's our problem. We distance ourselves from it, and we opened ourselves to by embracing too far the West, we opened ourselves to this extremist religious movements on the right. And so maybe we need something else. In other words, I think it's extremely difficult to think politically about trying to get support for reconstituting the old Mali. There's, of course, all sorts of other very worrying trends. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb had managed to attract virtually no popular support, and almost no one joined it as a small radical movement. When you're running cities and you have men with arms and in vehicles and guns, etc., it's a little more attractive to disenfranchised young men if you can join and someone hands you a gun and you get to ride around in cars. And it's very clear that Ansar ad-Din and Mujao, the Movement for Unity and Jihad in West Africa, are attracting some recruits in the region, not only in Mali, but in neighboring countries, including in surprising places like Senegal, but Niger, Mauritania, Algeria, etc., and perhaps even further afield. And then finally, obviously, the economic consequences of this in a very fragile environment, as I started, are extraordinarily difficult to try to think about how to recover. For all those reasons, I find myself extraordinarily pessimistic.